Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Premier Injuries YouTube channel. Now, game week one, we're almost done. Not quite. We still have Manchester United, who entertain Wolverhampton Wanderers on Monday at Old Trafford. So where better to start than with Erik ten Hag and news from Gary O'Neill. So the home side first. On a positive spin, it looks like Anthony Martial could be in contention to make the matchday squad. Of course, he hasn't featured at all through that close season programme due to a hamstring problem carried over from 22 to 23. So there's a possibility that he may make the bench. But of course, given those ongoing problems, he may not be risked. And Erik ten Hag has said previously that something needs to change if we're going to get on top of that Frenchman's fitness issues. With regards to questions about his striker, he's not overly concerned at the minute. Of course, he referenced the fact that Marcus Rashford can easily be deployed in that striker. So also Jadon Sancho. But new signing Rasmus Højbjerg, we know he arrived with that lower back issue that was identified through his medical. Now that's a stress-related response. It's one of those ones that you really need to be aware of. It needs to be managed, because if you push too hard, then the young striker could be out for an extended period. But as it stands, we're certainly looking at a few weeks in terms of managing that injury. Then he needs to get up to speed, get integrated with the squad, and then ultimately, be reintroduced to that match day environment. So ultimately, we could be looking at post-international break in September before Højlund is in and around and really pushing for a start in that Manchester United lineup. For Wolves, Gary O'Neill, of course, he hasn't been at the helm very long at all. He's come in. It's been a little bit of a whirlwind. Apparently, discussions and conversations about him potentially taking over from Julian Lopetegui had been taking place for around 7 to 10 days before they actually announced that he would be leaving. Gary O'Neill has got more or less a clean bill of health. There was one slight concern, that was Matthias Cunha. He missed a couple of days out with the squad early last week, but he has rejoined the group. So like I say, he should be there or thereabouts. And ultimately, Wolves haven't got any major concerns. But there's lots to talk about from the first weekend. We'll probably work back chronologically in terms of how those injuries occurred and who they actually happened to. So we'll go back to Sunday, where Tottenham travelled to Brentford. We saw Christian Romero open the scoring in the game, but he was substituted immediately after that because of a head problem. Now, despite there being an error with the paperwork completed by the Tottenham medical staff, they didn't report that as a concussion. It was just a head injury. It actually is indeed that a concussion. The medical team said that he was unsteady on his feet. Postecoglou said that they weren't prepared to take any risks. They did decide to err on the side of caution. Now, in terms of his involvement in game week 2, could he be available? Absolutely, yes. In terms of the protocol, there are evaluations to be taking place on a day-to-day basis, but day 6, which is when Tottenham will play again, could be the first day that in theory he could play. However, what it would mean is Christian Romero wouldn't have had a full day training with the group prior to match day. So that might be a consideration when looking ahead to game week 2. Davinson Sanchez is a player who could come in. For the home side, Ben Mee was a big admission from the home team. Thomas Frank later confirming that it was a calf strain that kept the defender out. A big blow for Ben Mee owners, in particular, me good self. But it looks as if it isn't too serious. He's one that's going to be assessed again on a daily basis to see how that injury evolves and responds to an increase in load and recovery as he steps up towards game week 2. So not guaranteed. It's a one that we're saying is questionable at this moment in time, but shouldn't be too far away. Matthias Jensen is a player who picked up an injury in the game, replaced around that 49 to 50 minute mark. That was a thigh injury. He'll be assessed as well. At the minute, I would say he's a bit of a bigger doubt. On Saturday night, we see Newcastle, my boys, entertain Villa at St James's Park. And unfortunately, we've seen what looked to be a pretty horrific injury to Tyrone Mings. We wish him a speedy recovery. That was the right knee. It was a bit of a coming together. I think it was Alexander Isak shoulder to shoulder, but it wasn't the challenge as such. What happens? Tyrone Mings was off balance. He was deaccelerating. You saw that knee in slow motion on the cameras. It buckled, it went inwards, and that's fairly indicative of an ACL injury. And I wouldn't be surprised if that MCL wasn't involved as well in possibly some meniscus or cartilage issues. He was later taken to hospital, local hospital at the RVI for further tests. Now, the club have come out and said that he suffered a significant setback, and I suspect it's already season over for Tyrone Mings. You follow that on the back of, that major injury for Emi Buendia on training on Wednesday, and that looks as if they're going to have two players certainly out, if not for all of the season, but the majority of the season. I think you can go back to 2015 when Tyrone Mings suffered a similar injury when he was at Bournemouth. Funny enough, Eddie Howe was his manager. That was ACL and MCL, and he spent well over a full year before he got back to full fitness. So we wish him well. We wish him a speedy recovery. It doesn't look great. He will need surgery on that, and we're just waiting for further updates with regards to the severity of that injury. Jerome Timber, Arsenal, he was another player in the televised game, early kickoff on Saturday, that pulled up. We've seen him go down towards the end of that first half. It was a little bit of a coming together. It wasn't clear on the mechanism what the actual problem was, but he limped through until at half time. He was assessed and evaluated during that 15-minute break, and he was given the all clear to continue. Came out for the second half, and what was a fairly innocuous sort of passing. He felt that pain towards the back of the leg, maybe just behind the knee, really high on the calf, went down. Again, it wasn't very clear or obvious what the issue was. Mikel Arteta said that the player will be assessed, again, evaluated to determine the extent of that problem. If there are any concerns, then Alexander Zinchenko is nearing a return from calf injuries and a couple of setbacks thrown in there. Isn't great in terms of his match fitness, but like I say, there are cover in that Gunners squad if Timber was to be out for any kind of period. Manchester City, they kicked off game week 1, the Premier League programme, on Friday night with what turned out to be a fairly comfortable win at Turf Moor. Kevin De Bruyne was a surprise starter for the citizens, only had minimal minutes in the Community Shield a week before. That was because of a hamstring problem that forced him off in the Champions League final, of course. And like I say, it was a little bit of a gamble, and it looked as if that gamble has backfired for Pep. Now, typically, we see two types of mechanism when we're looking at hamstring injuries. More common and more one that we associate with is players who are in high sprint when they're moving at high speeds, and instantly you see players pull up that sharp pain, almost that sniper gun effect when the player's being shot. And that's fairly evident. We didn't have that with Kevin De Bruyne. He played a pass. Again, it looked fairly innocuous, nothing there. And that's more of an indication that he's probably strained or overstretched the muscle, as opposed to maybe overloaded it when he was sprinting. That's the hip being flexed and the knee being fully extended, putting that muscle under more strain. And of course, he's not quite 100%, and that's why Pep Guardiola post-match said that it's a hamstring injury in and around the same area. Now, I don't want to speculate whether it's a recurrence or a re-injury of the same thing. It could just be, in a similar issue. If it was, a recurrence of that one that put him out of the Champions League, then we're looking at around about a couple of months. If not, that depends again on the severity of this latest setback. We could be looking at least a few weeks now. I'd be very surprised if De Bruyne was back before the international break. Like I say, they want to be uber cautious with Kevin De Bruyne. They don't want to rush him back and risk any further setbacks. City were also without John Stones on the night. That was related to what Pep called a reference to a minor groin or adductor issue or hip flexor. It was fairly vague. It was a training ground incident, nothing major. Doubtful for the Super Cup midweek, and as it currently stands, question marks over his availability for game week 2. Ruben Dias also missed out. That was a concussion-related absence. As long as he comes through the protocols, again, he should be there or thereabouts in terms of his availability next weekend in game week 2, but certainly not for the Super Cup. For Chelsea, Reece James was attracting a lot of attention within the community, and of course Mauricio Pochettino handed him the captain's armband. Fantasy manager were hopeful of the fact that the flying wing backs injury problems were well behind him, and it looked as if, unfortunately, he had suffered a little bit of a setback during that game against Liverpool on Sunday. However, Pochettino came out post-match, tried to allay any injury concerns with regards to Reece James, said that his withdrawal was more of a precautionary measure. It was planned, and it was due to the fact that it was fatigue related. Now, we know in terms of influencing factors for injuries, there are 2 sort of main red flags. One is if you have a history of injury problems and hamstring, which we know Reece James does. And secondly, fatigue. Now, we know his preseason program has been disrupted. There was some talk about that exploratory scan because his knee was causing discomfort. He also joined up with the club late due to illness in the US. So it hasn't been smooth sailing throughout the summer. And also, you can never quite replicate the demands and the physicalities of the Premier League by, in training and during these non-competitive matches. So I think there's an element of truth, although there's a lot of skeptics and there's a lot of, suggesting on the rumour mill that Pochettino was maybe being a little bit liberal with the truth there. But what I would say is, it's definitely a factor, fatigue. Could there be an injury there? Quite possibly. We're talking in the immediate aftermath of the game. Assessments, evaluations will still continue, and also maybe even over the next 24 to 48 hours, these problems can evolve. So, like I say, while I'm not going to suggest that Reece James is 100%, I think there is definitely, a shred of truth, or there is truth in the fact that it was fatigue, and that you need to be super, super cautious with Reece James given his problems. And finally, just a quick update on Alexander Mitrovic. We know it was Raul Jimenez started at the weekend. Mitrovic came on in the second half and it was one of those 3 substitutes that Marco Silva suggested helped change the games and tip it in the favour of the Cottagers. Looked to suffer an ankle problem. At one point, it was thought that he was going to be substituted and replaced. He didn't. He managed to stay out the game. But again, like I say, those types of injuries, and we know Mitrovic has had problems with his ankles in the past, can evolve over the next 24 to 48 hours. So one to keep an eye on. The reasons for him being benched in the opener, well, that relates to having his head turned really by a bid from Saudi Arabia over the summer. And that did keep him out of training for a little bit, and also out a lot of those preseason matches. He did return in those final games before game week 1. But Marco Silva said, yes, he is available, but maybe just didn't have that 100% sharpness that they were looking for in the opener. But, if that ankle issue isn't a problem, we expect him to train fully and normally this week. And the striker should certainly be pushing for a start in game week 2. So that's it. That's your extended Premier injuries daily roundup. Like I say, in the midst of game week 1, you can always check out the premierinjuries.com table website, or at Ben Dinnery on Twitter for all of the latest news. And by all means, pop a question in the box below. Feel free to ask me by ever channel you find easiest. We'll see you all again very soon.